Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. It's a couple minutes past, and I'm assuming we'll have others join us as they come. If you don't mind muting for the time being here as we get started there, so we can listen to our participants' presentation. And this meeting is being recorded as usual so that we can distribute it to others and for content. So good afternoon, my name is David Sturts with Cooperative Strategies, and along with the National Council on School Facilities, we've been hosting a weekly conversation about reopening, hosting at a consistent time since April, Thursdays at 3 Eastern, and some of us are able to join for that live time and then putting this up on YouTube on the website, on our website, for a resource to be distributed for school districts to use as they see fit and as needed. So what we are doing this week is we're going to introduce some interesting research on surveying learning loss and how that's being approached systematically sometimes and not systematically in others. And Sean and Lisa are here, University of Washington think tank. I'm going to introduce them in a little. Actually, I'll let my colleague Susan introduce them here in a minute. But we're excited to get into the conversation, so we're going to get right to it. So the objectives for today's webinar is we're going to look at some national trends on school closures writ large. What are Sean and Lisa finding that school districts are doing from a representative sampling? We're going to talk about some analysis of those remediation strategies, again, systemic and systematic and otherwise, and then some promising practices in terms of addressing learning loss, which we all know is happening and without a doubt happening inequitably across the country this year. And so with that, I'm actually going to, since Susan Miller is one of our colleagues from our Colorado office, and she's happens to also be a board member in Jeffco school district there. She bridged this connection. She are going to collaborate on facilitating this conversation. As we go through, and Sean and Lisa provide their research, and we'll just ask that you have questions and comments. You put those in the chat, and Susan and I will feed them to our speakers as we go. Susan?
Great, thank you so very much, David. Welcome, everybody. We're really excited to have the Center for Reinventing Public Education with us this afternoon. Many of you may know that they put together a database last March and April when schools started to go into the remote mode. And they started looking at about 88 of the largest school districts across the country, just how remote learning was taking place, how people were ebbing and flowing in that whole new space. And certainly I think we were on warp speed from about March through the end of May, just with the total new remote mode, that we were all experiencing across the country. Since that time, they have started to look at all of the quote unquote restart, reentry, reboot plans of about, I want to say over 100 and some school districts across the country, which I think they're going to touch on this afternoon with the type of work that they've been doing and looking at how schools are considering, or districts are considering, addressing the learning losses. Certainly facilities are a critical component for students. That's where they interact with teachers. That's where they live and breathe with their learning experiences. And the ability not to be face-to-face is certainly of a concern, but really how the interventions are going to work with teachers interacting with students is going to be a critical factor. So with that, I'm going to pass it on over to Sean and to Lisa for the presentation. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, Sean and Lisa.
Yeah, thanks everyone for having us. And David, are our slides in here, or did you want me to share my screen?
Yeah, we got them in.
Got it. Perfect. We'll try to keep this conversational, and I know sometimes webinars can be unpleasant when people just drone on, but we did have some slides prepared, and again, just to give you a sense of who we are and what we've been doing, CRPE, as we pronounce it, is the Center on Reinventing Public Education. We're based at the University of Washington, and we've founded in 1993, and we do a lot of research across the country, so not just in Washington. And as Susan mentioned, we have a number of different projects where we've been trying to keep tabs on what are districts and states actually doing on reopening. And so in the In the spring, we began to look at sort of remote learning. In the summer, we looked at summer school. We have a deep dive database that's on our website, crpe.org, and you can look in and you can see which districts are in there. There's 106 districts. A lot of the data that we are talking about today will come from that database because that's where we've done the most in-depth analysis. We also looked at 18 charter management organizations. So we're happy to take some questions on that, although our data will just be on districts. We also have a representative sample that is 477 districts, and this is a weighted sample. So the data that we have from this sample actually reflects what districts are doing across the country. We don't have as many indicators there, but it does give us some really good data. And lastly, we've been doing a little bit of work looking at what states have done in sort of terms of providing guidance to school districts or what their requirements are. So we can go ahead to the next slide. So this is from our representative sample, and it's probably not too surprising to you all, but about half the districts across the country are actually going to be opening with in-person instruction. And that is a bit of a shift. So that data comes from a survey we did on this August 17th and 21st. So might have changed a little bit, but I don't think so because a lot of school districts are now opening. So they're kind of locked into what they're gonna do. 12% of districts are what we would say are hybrid, or so that's where students are attending for partial day, or maybe they're alternating weeks or they're alternating days within the week. And 25% have remote instruction, and then the rest are kind of either varies or we couldn't determine or they hadn't decided yet. There's actually a number of districts that hadn't decided when we looked. So we can go to the next slide. But the interesting thing is that when we looked at the locale, and this is based on sort of the census designation for the district, there's actually quite a difference between city, big urban districts, suburban districts, and rural districts. So you can see the city districts, most of them, the big majority of them are actually remote, or they're starting the year with remote instruction. I think at this point, every district still has hopes to open in person, but they haven't, most of them actually haven't identified the date when that would happen. And you can see in the suburb, it's more of a mix. There's more hybrid scheduling there. And then in the rural districts, that's where there's a lot more in-person instruction. Of course, our survey is based on districts. So it's not gonna tell you the number of students per se, but our deep dive database tends to have a lot more of those big urban districts. So that's when we're talking about our sort of deep dive data on the next slide, it's reflecting more of those urban districts. So we can go to the next slide.
So Sean, just to clarify, this is the representative sampling. This is the 106. This is the representative
sample. Yes. So this okay. Reflects districts across the country.
Yeah, that's a stark difference.
So I'll introduce this and I'll let Lisa kind of talk about some of what we're finding on learning loss. So we, Susan and David were talking just what might be some interesting data to pull out. We have a number of indicators. So a high level, this is again based on our deep dive into 106 districts fall reopening plans. Addressing learning loss appears to be primarily what I would say is a teacher-driven activity. And so that is perhaps makes sense. I think if we think about what teachers do every year, they're kind of getting an informal sense of where their students are. Maybe they have some assessments, but certainly with the, we'll talk a little bit about some of the research, but with the disruption that students had this spring and this summer, I think we're probably hoping to see a little bit more of a systematic approach. Lisa can talk about some of the data that we actually have in the sample.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. So as Sean mentioned earlier, most of our districts in the 106 district database, the deep dive database, are in urban areas. So you'll kind of see a larger shift towards remote learning in that sense. But out of the 106 districts that we looked at, only 41 of them expect schools to diagnose student learning loss at the beginning of the year. And out of those 41, 34 are opening remote, 5 are in person, and 2 are hybrid. And of those 41, 40 districts had a plan to provide or increase interventions for students based on learning loss. I have the numbers here as well. Of those 40, it is 32 are opening remote, 4 in person, 2 are hybrid, and 1 varies. The varies is Hawaii because it varies by island how they're reopening. And then only 19 districts had identified some tutoring plan. 14 are remote, 5 are in person. We aren't entirely sure what those tutoring plans will look like yet, although we have seen some where, you know, they might be partnering with a local community organization like the YMCA to provide tutoring services. I know in Tennessee that they partner with Homework Hotline, where students can call in to this organization, and they have certified teachers on board to provide homework help, primarily after school hours.
Yes, so the, we can pause for some questions here, but one thing that Susan had asked us was if they were planning to be remote, how are they going to be doing their assessments? And the truth is we don't know. There wasn't a lot of detail, and most of our information comes from what's publicly available. And so there's actually quite a bit of a range about what districts have actually posted on their websites. Some have a very detailed document, and the other, some, you know, it's just more sort of high level information to parents about how they would enroll or what choices they would have. And one thing that I think that's kind of shifted over August, a lot of districts are starting to put their plans in place or on their website in June or even July. And there really was still the hope that they could open in person. And then so there's sort of been a shift. And we've even seen some districts delay opening in some of the big urban areas like Texas, for example. So that's why there's, in some ways, we don't really know exactly how they're planning to diagnose learning loss, even if they had identified an assessment, if they're trying to do that remotely.
Just real quickly on the tutoring plans, we're seeing teachers putting up office hours and saying when they would be available to have interaction with students and some of the learning plans that we're seeing out here in the Front Range. And I'm wondering, are you all seeing that as well as options for students to have access to their teachers for tutoring or extra time or extra interaction with them during their hybrid or remote spaces?
Yes, I know in my district, we each have our own districts that we code, but I know overall we have been seeing those. And if you look at like a district's sample schedule that they have, they usually have it at the end of the day for office hours, and usually for if you have questions, if you know, if maybe you need to do small group instruction, it's built into there too.
Do you all have any data to suggest how districts are paying for this? Is this within existing contracts with teachers and they're reallocating hours, or is this you know, a volunteer thing that we're asking teachers, that teachers are sort of volunteering to do above and beyond, or is there additional money in the pipeline?
Yeah, I think primarily it's kind of coming from their existing per pupil dollars or their general their general fund. You know, one thing that we've, like Lisa mentioned, we've been getting some of our information from the sample schedules that districts have posted, and certainly I think, especially when the remote, we're seeing, you know, maybe they'll sort of have 4 hours, up to 4 hours. That seems to be the average on synchronous instruction or real-time instruction, and sometimes they've even identified. So the thought is the afternoons might be the time for when teachers do one-on-one work, or they do additional small group instruction. Some districts have even identified certain days where, like, Wednesdays is sort of all asynchronous. So students would be working at home on their learning platform, but they might, you know, there's either teacher office hours, or the teacher might schedule time to sort of meet with a small group or do some of the interventions.
Okay. One of the questions that came in on a different topic, Rob from Iowa posted in the chat there was, Of the representative sampling, the 477, do you have a breakdown of urban, suburban, rural, what percentage are in each, more or less?
I don't know that off the top of my head. It's a good question, but what I will say is it's a weighted sample, so the data would be representative of all the rural districts across the country.
Check.
I can
Okay.
go ahead and post our report in the chat box.
Perfect. Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah, it should have that information there. So I'll kind of run through some of these slides on the research, and then we have some examples of what districts are doing, which I think will be interesting to folks. So, as I kind of mentioned, we were frankly a little surprised we haven't seen more on learning loss or addressing learning loss. I think everyone knows that there's sort of the summer slide, or there's concerns about, there's already an existing achievement or opportunity gap out there. But it's fair to say there's a broad research consensus that the disruption from COVID-19 is just going to make everything worse. And there's one paper out there from folks related to NWEA that have kind of tried to estimate they've found that like 40 to 70% of the content from last year would have been covered. So that's essentially a gap of 30% to even up to 60%. So it's pretty significant, and it's likely to, as we would expect, it's likely to vary, by across schools, or just the quality of the program that was offered, or just the challenges that the students would have in accessing curriculum and content, particularly for families of color, families impacted by poverty. They're going to be disproportionately impacted. One thing that we noticed in our scans of remote learning in the spring is that support for students with disabilities was just not very comprehensive in many districts. And there is a sense that elementary students and students who are already struggling academically might have been most least engaged with remote learning. And these are all things that researchers are of course still trying to really tease out. I think I saw a study coming out from England across the Atlantic that they're saying on average students had had a gap of 30%. There was 30% of content that wasn't covered there, and certainly I think their disruption wasn't quite as long as sustained as our disruption is. We can go to the next slide.
Sean, can I ask you a real quick question about that?
Yeah.
Since a lot of states are considering that they're going to waive those assessments from last year, of course, they're done, they're gone.
Yeah.
What is the sense of districts doing the assessment and then with follow-up of states doing assessments this year to kind of give benchmarks? I mean, I know we'll do maps. Those assessments would be prevalent for a lot of places with NWEA, of course, but how are the states going to be measuring those potential losses?
It's a great question. Yeah, certainly the standardized tests that every state has as part of their plan under ESSA, the federal education law, those were kind of universally waived in the spring. I think there's always what I hear, there's always a question of how timely and useful is that data, and sometimes it seems like the teachers in the fall don't get access to that data when they would need it. And so a lot of times when we're talking about assessments, it's district administered assessments or even teacher administered assessments. In terms of standardized testing in the spring, I think it's a big unknown at the moment. I think there's probably going to be a lot of people who are saying, that they don't think the state should require it. I think a lot of us would say, no, you should require it, because those state standardized tests are the best data that we have to be able to compare districts to one another, or compare schools to one another. Lisa, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I mean, that's pretty much what I was thinking as well.
Okay.
So on this slide, one of the things that there's had been discussion, I think, out there of well, should schools have a set remediation time, or should they pick up where they left off? And there's some evidence that actually the best practices to accelerate learning, that you really want to try to keep the students on pace with the appropriate content, and then use the assessments then allow you to provide those interventions or extra tutoring to catch students up. There's a lot of research out there actually that tutoring works, and it's sort of the 2-to-1 tutoring or small groups, but there's some interesting aspects of how often it should be done. It should be pretty high dosage and it needs to be sustained. And then ideally it's a structured program where the tutors have been coached. So it doesn't necessarily need to be a certificated teacher, but it should be someone who's had some training on how to provide that tutoring, or especially I think, I'm not remembering exactly, but I would imagine you would want to have a fair amount of content level expertise as well.
You know, Sean, if I can, that I'm nodding along. In my former life, I ran a tutoring company for 8 years, and it was one-on-one in the home. And I'll tell you that I predominantly focused on students in urban school districts where there were, you know, high concentrations of poverty. And what I found is that when I personally would go into the home, and when my instructors, tutors would go into the homes, what was working really well is when we were tutoring the parent and the kid. It was supporting the learning at home in person in a way that had a personal touch to it that just you can't do, you know, sort of on the phone, remote, you know, FAQ style. But really seeing, we were finding that, you know, really the success rates in about 24 hours a year plus of instruction was kind of what we were aiming for, and would see regular demonstrable results from our summative assessments, for what that's worth.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think in some of our districts we've tracked closely, we have seen some interesting new forms of parent engagement or parent training. And Dallas Independent School District comes to mind. I think they had over 18 hours of Zoom sessions that parents could attend, and I think they had at one point over 2,000 parents had kind of signed up for one of those sessions. And I've even seen some districts, I think it might have been Dallas, they've actually talked about training parents on the data. So if there is an assessment like NWA, the MAP assessment, they would train parents on how to interpret that and use that. So I think that it goes to your point of, as many people on this call probably recognize, if you have children, or certainly you're hearing from teachers in your systems, that really the parents are kind of being a co-educator. And I think we've seen some promising examples of districts trying to help better support parents in that role.
Sean, one of the questions that just came in is if states or districts are actually starting to discuss about moving to mastery competency and moving students along in that way based on the assessments that are going to be provided to them.
Yeah,
and just for, if I may, just for clarity, if folks or maybe aren't familiar with all the terminology, this is, you're not promoting a kid to the next level until you get a base, you pass. You can't pass with subpar, like a C, like you pass with demonstrated mastery.
Right.
Proficiency based. Yeah.
Right.
It's certainly, I think we've heard a little bit of discussion about moving to more mastery based or competency based curriculum. So Cleveland was talking a little bit about that. I'm not sure exactly how far they've implemented it. Certainly some of the work we saw in the summer about summer school was tied to sort of third grade reading guarantee that that a number of states or districts have. And so there was additional summer school opportunities for children to sort of master reading, otherwise they wouldn't be promoted to fourth grade. I haven't seen as much on other content areas, and certainly my sense is, and Lisa might have a different take on it, is my sense is that high school definitely still really seems to be sort of Carnegie units. And so a lot of the focus is still just on, making sure you pass your class and then providing credit recovery. Now within those classes, maybe some of them are sort of more tied to mastery-based or competency-based framework and less on sort of just, doing assignments and grades. That's something that years ago, so I think even the state of Vermont was going to revamp its diploma and sort of have that more competency-based or proficiency-based. But I don't think I've seen a ton of that in sort of this context of remote learning. Lisa, did you have any
It's
thoughts?
interesting because it stands to reason that with the use of electronic tools, that are Khan Academy-esque
Right.
in a way, that mastery-based promotion is almost inherent in the model.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I pretty much have been seeing the same things as Sean. Although I will say that when I do see some districts mention promoting based on grades, typically they would kind of not use the last quarter grades from the spring, and they would use the ones from the previous quarter.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, is that in many cases, the grades that students received in spring were sometimes based on where they had been in March before the shift to remote learning. In some cases, districts had said students could improve their grades. So if they were, failing, for example, the work that they did in the spring would allow them to, improve their grades to get to a passing. A couple of systems, I think, just switched to credit, no credit in many cases. One thing we've noticed this year is, I think, almost across the board, districts are being a lot more clear that they're sort of grading in the way that they would have before COVID-19. So that the expectation for students going in with remote learning or hybrid schedule or whatnot is that you will sort of have your typical grade, and maybe they've changed some of the elements of participation or some of the non-content pieces, but there is, in every district I've looked at, and I think our data bears this out, is the grades are going to be given this semester.
Yeah.
This slide is a little bit off tangent to what we've kind of presented on learning loss, but definitely the research is showing that teachers need training and time for planning, especially when they're doing remote learning or hybrid models. And so some of the research has suggested that teacher quality is more important than how learning is delivered. I would have to dive in a little bit more on that study to see what they mean by delivery, because I think there's a lot we're going to learn about sort of the mix of synchronous and asynchronous instruction in remote learning. So of course, the next one I think makes a lot of sense, is students need to learn how to work independently. And of course, this is something I think we've talked about in education circles for a while, is sort of like, how do we get students to own a little bit more of their learning? And certainly in the competency or proficiency based model, sometimes the idea is the student themselves would kind of propose, how do I demonstrate knowledge? So in some ways they're not even being tested in the same way that we would have. And then of course the peer-to-peer interactions, and I believe they're talking about teacher-to-teacher interactions, can be really motivating. And I think we've seen in the fall planning, I think we've seen districts kind of acknowledge that we need to give teachers time to have more collaboration or more opportunities to collaborate as much as they can, especially if they're in a remote environment. And I think there's some times where it could be frustrating maybe for parents that students are only getting 3 to 4 hours of synchronous work, but there is a lot. I think we all know, if we know teachers, like there's a lot of prep that is going into sort of having to change your systems. And one other point I'd make on this is that a lot of districts have been pretty clear. The big urban districts we've looked at, they've really standardized the platform that they're using this fall compared to spring. So in many cases, districts are saying, hey, our district is a Google Classroom district, and so you need to get all your content in Google Classroom, and that is the way students are going to get assignments, whether they're in school or not, or they're saying Schoology or all of the different platforms,
Canvas or whatever. Yeah.
And so that certainly that is I think just from my observations when I've been in classrooms, even schools that were experimenting with personalized learning, like that is a big shift, I think, for a lot of teachers from sort of the paper-based way they would have approached work in the past. So here's some promising practices. So we're calling them promising because we want to be good researchers and not say we know what's best yet. We're still very new. But on sort of diagnostics, here's some things that we noted that our analysts, our team of analysts, we have about 12 analysts that work on this every week, trying to keep up with updates. And so Anchorage, they're using those assessments that are in the platforms like iReady or ALEX. Those are sort of those platforms that students often can do. They're self-paced, but they're good in that they have diagnostic tools in them, and then teachers can look at data in them. So in Anchorage was really calling that out and sort of setting an expectation that all students are going to be doing that across the board at their schools. Miami-Dade has really interesting, let me just look at my notes here. Really interesting learning loss index. I believe it's targeted towards English language learners and students with disabilities. And it was really looking at their data from last academic year. And so they had looking at grades, absences, not just the assessment data in iReady, but the usage data. So you can actually track like how often were students logged in, how much, how far did they get in the content. I think they're even looking at IEP goals and sort of how, if students were on track to meet graduation. So it's not quite a diagnostic of content always, but it's definitely a lot of indicators that research supports. If you're not, if you're not having above a D or F GPA in 9th grade, that you're not going to graduate. So they're trying to get ahead of that. And then Baltimore City, they haven't actually identified what the diagnostic is they're using in their plan. I just checked yesterday, but they have set the expectation that there is going to be a diagnostic assessment 3 times this year. There's a number of other formative assessments that they're planning to do by different content areas. The first one they're saying, I think Baltimore starts next Tuesday, but they're saying, it's actually going to be in late September, early October. And I thought that was interesting because they're sort of saying we need some time for students to get acclimated to remote learning again, get to know their teachers before we just go right into an assessment. And I think we've seen that in a couple of districts.
Sean and Lisa, this is, thinking of our audience here, we've been primarily focused on operations and facilities and so forth, and talking with the folks who manage all the logistics and all the money and the facilities and make stuff happen, right? And so when you're looking at this, you're really looking at what's a systematic approach versus a sort of a teacher-centric, and of course it's that systematic approach where that overlaps with our audience here. And I, for one, working in that world, I'm not familiar with iReady. That looks like some kind of Apple product, I assume, but I don't know. So could you explain like a little bit about what these platforms are, and then, are districts basically looking at creating their own, or these 3, for example, and others, looking at creating their own supplemental pre-post test, and that's what it is? It's a pre-post, or are we talking about or a formative kind of assessment that's ongoing and tweaking and informing instruction along the way? Because it goes back to that mastery question versus just sort of pass fail. Where if we're going to be more formative and keeping a pulse on the learning loss and the learning achievements, that's a very different approach than test in September, test in May. How'd we do?
Yeah, I will admit I'm more in the policy realm, and Lisa is too. So we probably don't know the best explanation of formative and summative assessments, but the iReady and ALEX platforms and other platforms like that. There's ST Math and other things. Those are sort of online.
Check. Okay.
Those are sort of like online programs that children complete. So it's when I've observed it, it's sort of like,
my kids use ST, so I get that.
Yeah, a little module of work, but sometimes where each kid, when they log in, where each kid is, they get sort of like the module that's for them. and that's based again on sort of like a diagnostic within the platform of what do they know and what do they need to work on. And teachers like Khan Academy even, some of these teachers can actually kind of look at the data and then reassign, problems and whatnot. I think what we had hoped to see is that districts would actually have a more formal sort of approach to having some kind of learning loss tool. And so that might be closer to what like an NWA assessment would be, the MAP assessment, which that data is sort of administered. It's really great data for districts to sort of see where students are across schools and across systems, but it's also meant to be data that teachers can react to and then plan in real time, which is a little bit different than I think sort of the standardized tests that we have in every state, which are sort of like point in time, here's kind of what we learned. Lisa, do you have anything else to add on that?
No, I mean, it's kind of like you said, we're not as deep into the assessments. Although I did see that Angela has a good point about iReady. They mentioned that it's a great tool for online reading and math placement based on each student's level. So it kind of tracks where they are at, which I think is really helpful for the beginning of the school year.
And I think some of the plans have talked about, and when we marked whether they had a sort of learning loss approach or learning loss idea, like some would just say teachers would provide their own assessments. And so that might be sort of the more, pre and post test or sort of the exit ticket, kind of the different things that happen in classes. The challenge there is that if that is kind of all bespoke or teacher driven, it doesn't give you a great sense, I think, across classes or across schools. And so from a system-wide approach, I think it would be difficult for us to know, well, if teachers are all using different assessments or just sort of the stuff that's baked into sort of the curriculum they have, it's difficult for us to plan for that systemically. Like, well, how many students are really, needing some type of remediation, and then how do we best meet those students, or how do we best identify those students? The next slide kind of leads into this point, and Dallas, again, is one that we noted has started to think about what comes next. I think that's the title of the webinar, right? What do we do next, right? And so they have a number of things that they're kind of thinking about, and their plan is to sort of adopt a formal plan at the board level by December. And so one would be sort of like, revamping our summer school. I'm trying to remember what they did for summer. I don't think they had a ton of summer offerings this past summer, but so they're already thinking about, well, what do we do in the summer of 2021? Or there's something called intercession, and that would be extra instructional days that are kind of placed throughout the year. And I'm not sure if they're thinking that might be something that's done in the collegiate world. I think when you hear intercession, it's sort of like a specialized semester. I'm not sure if that's what they mean. But it would definitely impact every student in the sense that the year might be extended, but there'd be certain days where they really do that extra one-on-one support. Or there are ideas that they might have a full redesign. And so that would just be a longer school year for everyone, more instructional days for everyone. In the operation and financial sense, I don't know how they're thinking about paying for that, and I think
you knew my question.
As you guys know, it depends a lot on each state in terms of, can you do operational levies, or is your state going to be providing extra money, or perhaps there's a hope that if there's additional stimulus dollars, or they can try to apply some of the CARES Act dollars that got existing to that. Certainly, I think when we've looked at summer school, typically summer school is something that's not in the master contract. Teachers get paid extra. It's sort of something you do. You get an extra stipend for, they hire substitutes. So if they were to sort of extend the year, there would have to probably be, there's going to be increased cost, I think, in terms of
some kind of operating levy or something of that nature.
And there's a couple other districts I think have mentioned this. Tulsa, I think, is one that someone mentioned might be thinking about an intersection. The other interesting one that we put here, and I'm happy to take some questions on this slide, is St. Louis, and they had, like many districts, they had sort of asked parents, all the districts in our deep dive had really done a lot of work to ask parents, what is your preferred model? So even if we plan to be in person, do you want a remote option? And in St. Louis, actually only a third had opted for in-person instruction. The other 2/3 had opted for 2 different types of remote learning that they were offering. Unfortunately, the district decided that they needed to, I think they're a little bit atypical for districts in Missouri, but the St. Louis public school system decided that they needed to be, have remote instruction. But the families that had opted for in-person instruction are actually being given access to instructional support centers. So we're seeing this kind of grow as a trend. They're called learning hubs in other places. Sometimes they might even be using the term pods. So those students are going to be able to go to, I think it's usually at schools, but could be at other city facilities. There'll be internet access. They'll be engaging with their teacher and their classmates through the computer, much like if they were at home. But there would be supervision from non-teaching staff. And I think we're wondering, and this is something we're planning to explore more at CRPE, is like, would these sort of instructional support centers, these learning hubs, would this be a great way to sort of provide additional one-on-one support, or sort of bring the tutors in, or just help identify the children that they're most in need of additional support just because they don't have a parent or someone who can help them at home.
Mm-hmm. So non-instructional staff as supervising and the instructional staff beaming in.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting, I would say it's a kind of an interesting division of labor, but in many cases, I think the staff that are being deployed in St. Louis and some other places could be things like, your campus safety officers or supervisors, the folks that supervise at recess. It could be office aides, it could be the nurses, it could be, we're wondering even if it could be like counselors or administrators as well.
Mm-hmm.
So Sean, is that being driven by teacher contracts? Is that being driven by, where parents are saying 2/3 of us want to stay home and only 1/3 want to be in the buildings? What's the dynamic for that? And then the other one with Dallas, the same question is with the extended proposal for, going for a longer time period. Are the contracts with teachers being renegotiated, or at least are they in conversations with the teacher unions?
Yeah, I believe in a number of districts here in Seattle, the district and the teachers union just came to an agreement about this year. I think they've sort of, in some districts, it seems like the contract gets renegotiated every year, which I find surprising. But I think in a lot of districts, it's sort of been an additional sort of negotiation on, that's supplemental to the main contract that sort of says, what does remote learning look like? And I think in many cases, there's been, teachers unions have been pushing for more remote learning, and certainly there's even been some lawsuits, I think, in Texas. Cypress is Fairbanks is one where I think there was a lawsuit, and I'm not sure if it's been settled. And so there is that dynamic, but I would say in many cases when districts have surveyed parents, the numbers of parents who would want to remain home or keep their children home, they're not wildly divergent from teachers as well. The numbers seem to be pretty similar based on the sort of the surveying that the districts did. I think a lot of the districts that have chosen to start remotely, we're often just looking at it's kind of the conditions of the health conditions, but I also think there's a big sense of that in many ways the school district is an aircraft carrier. It's kind of hard to turn on a dime, and so districts were reluctant, and this is maybe playing out in higher ed, like we're reluctant to sort of try to start and then have to stop and then start again. And I think we've heard anecdotally, and I think the districts were getting this in their survey data too, that parents really did not want that sort of approach. They sort of didn't want to be sort of on and then have to stay home for 2 weeks, then maybe go on again. Lisa, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's what I'm seeing too. I mean, at least from the districts that I look at, there's only so much you can do to plan for closures moving forward. I know that we talked about like the learning management systems like Canvas, and I know that a lot of districts shifted to that so that they can kind of dynamic if they have to. But I do see in like the parent surveys that the districts send out that a lot of parents just don't want that for their kids.
And I think that the question about Dallas is interesting. Why, what's driving that conversation on learning loss? And I think some of that is actually coming from the school board interest and the superintendent sort of leading the way. I think I would say at this point, the conversations about changing the year, or thinking about the year going forward, seem to be more driven at the superintendent or board level. But I think it's actually a really great thing for them to be leading on, and I think we've been kind of noting the lack of lack of good guidance from states, and I think in some ways states had in the spring, many states had sort of said, what is your remote learning plan, and we're kind of evaluating that. And then when it comes to sort of like learning loss or sort of addressing how do we change education in this really uncertain year, we actually haven't seen a strong enough guidance from states on that. Partly it might be due to the uncertainty, but I think there's, in some ways, districts really have been left to themselves to come up with a lot of solutions, which frankly is a lot to expect from districts.
Yeah. When they're just trying to keep everybody safe. I mean, Sean and Lisa, this is one of those topics, about what to do systematically about approaching learning loss. It's, it all is going to boil down to increased time spent working, identifying which students need it the most, and then mobilizing and executing those resources. So we were spending time and money, and in the midst of the current plan right now, the clients that we're working with and just the discussions having on this forum and others, this is kind of down the line. Like, everybody knows it's there, but right now we've got to keep the doors open. We got to get our HVAC system commissioned. We've got to get our cleaning, blah blah blah, masks, so on so forth. Really, point is, I'd be really curious to see like when districts are starting to materialize and formally propose and start to execute these plans that you're talking about. Do you have any idea about when you expect to, when some of these plans you're hearing are going to mature, so that that information will be pushed out? And the reason I say that is, we're looking for who's going to be first and shoot, and then we'll follow, right? And so it'd be great to be able to anticipate, hey, if you all have a pulse on, I would think by November, by December, by whenever, we're going to have a good bank of plans. Am I formulating my question okay? Does it make sense?
Well, I think
address it.
Yeah, I think I can answer it in one way is that our team at CRPE, we've been thinking about, well, how often do we keep updating our database? As how often do we, because certainly plans were changing, and sort of sometimes we would see drafts or PowerPoints, and then we get the like full PDF. And so we've been trying to get a handle on that, because I think we had thought at one point sort of the school year will start and sort of, then we'll be off running to the races. I think now we're realizing that this year is probably going to have a lot of changes and different learning modalities, and maybe even changing instructional minute requirements and things like that as we go out throughout the year. So to your question of like, have we anticipated sort of like a subsequent sort of longer term plan from most districts? I don't think we have. I think Dallas is really the first, until I saw them doing it. That's one that I do track. Until I saw them saying we're going to adopt a formal plan in December. That's sort of our long-term focus. I don't think we've seen that, but I definitely, it's fair to
See
say
if we can get them on.
yeah, we
Be good
could.
to talk
Yeah,
to
it would be great. I think it would be great for states to sort of push district. You know, once maybe once the dust settles a little bit, you know, schools, many school systems haven't started yet, and there's still a lot of questions about how they just logistically start up. It would be a good thing for states to kind of say, is like, okay, let's take a step back and now think about what is our long-term plan. You certainly, Paul Hill, who's the founder of CRPE, had a post up on our blog a while back about how New Orleans recovered from Katrina and the flood after. And you know, certainly it was, you know, it was multiple years of sort of schools having to figure out where are these students at, and really how do we help catch them up? How do we help address the trauma they've had? And it wasn't something that was just done in 1 year. It was a multiple year endeavor. Let me just get through this one real quick, and then we can go to some of our questions. So again, this one we might joke as sort of the two districts that sometimes get a lot of negative press. We did find two good things, and apologies to anyone who's from those districts. Fairfax actually had identified that their Fridays, you know, most students are not going to have synchronous learning, but they are going to make sure that's time that's used for interventions for English language learners, students with disabilities, and then other identified students. So I think the expectation there is that either teacher referral or some kind of diagnostic, the other academically struggling students. And then Los Angeles Unified, it's a small pilot in the way of things in LA, 500 students, but they partnered with an organization called Step Up Tutoring. That's going to provide one-on-one tutoring to the students that's outside their regular time. And the idea is, and they're pairing that with the strategy to have aides, substitutes, and some other support teachers or resource teachers provide small group instructions. So that the idea is that the primary teacher of record that can do, you know, sort of the more you know, whole group conversations or larger group conversations, and not just be doing all their time doing interventions. So it's a nice way to try to balance some of the workload for teachers. And then if we go to the next slide, we have some more interventions, I forgot. Baltimore, so I think this is Baltimore honestly has a really good fall plan. One interesting thing is they, for their 9th graders who they noticed were disengaged with virtual learning, they're going to pair them up with mentors from Maryland University. And so those mentors are actually going to be doing two things. They're going to strengthen some of their core academic skills, but also try to build relationships that support the transition to high school. This is a big thing that we're hearing. I think you guys are probably hearing this, is that really the transition to middle school and the transition to high school are points where people are really worried, because you have students who are going to be in classes and they don't know everyone and they don't know the teachers. So every student's sort of experiencing that, but it's just going to be a lot harder for those transition years.
Are they doing that remotely with the Maryland students, or are they doing that in small groups in some way, shape, or form?
Yeah, I believe they're gonna do that remotely to start.
Okay.
And then the last one is Providence in Rhode Island. Again, and we've seen this in a number of districts where they have sort of put time into the day for academic interventions. But Providence was pretty good because they'd identified a number of programs that they would actually be using. And some of these are folks, things you've probably seen like Eureka Math and Khan Academy.
Right.
And then the last slide is sort of like thinking forward. So again, we always want to acknowledge, sometimes it seems like we're critical of districts. We know it's crazy, it's been difficult, but we do think there's some things that districts might want to ask about, which I think has impacts on sort of the operations and facilities. And so the first one is sort of just like, how do we really work with our state or area districts to develop a good assessment strategy? The second one is if as we sort of move to more hybrid schedules or outdoor spaces, like, is there a way to sort of prioritize that for assessments or relationship building or interventions? And we've seen a few plans where, and some of the CMOs have actually seen, like, teachers might be able to, even though they're doing remote learning, teachers might be able to say, like, hey, I'm going to meet a small group of 5 students or 10 students in the park, or maybe even in their neighborhood. So they're not doing it at school yet, but they might be trying to build that face-to-face time. The next one is, like, how do we really prioritize the most vulnerable students for in-person interactions, and how do we identify those students? It does go back to the assessments, but it could also go back to other data, like students who are just not logging in, or students who had attendance problems already, things like that. And then this last one is, again, this sort of emerging idea of learning hubs. It's sort of taking the parent pod, pandemic pod, and putting it into the, it's like, how can a district sort of, create a safe place, or with partnership with community organizations, the city recs department, to that provide internet access and supervision. And then how do we coordinate that with sort of the academic side of things? How do we supplement, we're giving them a safe place, but can we also bring in that tutoring, the related services that they should be getting under their IEP, things like that?
A follow-up question to that, Sean, it came up in the chat space as well, is how school districts are partnering with other community organizations, be them the Boys and Girls Club, be them local churches, be them, rec centers that are hubs for communities,
Yeah.
and how that's interfacing with school districts. And I know we've been talking about hubs and how people could access even just the school facilities for small group gatherings of various students. And what about using the rec centers? But there's liability questions, I know, that have come along in terms of how that impacts those organizations or those facilities with the community governments.
I know at Pittsburgh Public Schools, they have a list of organizations they're partnering with, including the Boys and Girls Club. And I believe that they are actually opening up some of their school facilities so that the Boys and Girls Club or other community partners can run these learning hubs there. So they're able to use their unused school buildings, essentially.
And one of the districts I track is Wake County in North Carolina, and they have a group called the Wake Ed Partnership. And I think it's similar to this example from Vonnie about Salem Kaiser. Like, they're partnering, they have identified the Boys and Girls Club and the YMCA. And so the district in some ways is acting as a communication tool to sort of help parents find those resources. And I think we're very much interested, and we're hoping to do a new project where we kind of track all of these emerging partnerships where districts and community partners, or the city, in many cases, city governments are partnering more closely, which would allow, hopefully, for better sort of alignment of, I saw an example, it might have been in Anchorage, where they had mentioned the YMCA is planning to offer learning hubs, or sort of taking their day camp or aftercare programs. And I said, there'll be time during the day for your student to do their academic work, their synchronous work. And so hopefully the Y is sort of able to see when those times are, when those students are expected to do synchronous activities. It'd be interesting to see if there can be close collaboration between the districts. The liability question, I think, is a great one. I've even heard some districts and charter operators ask the question, and I think it's sort of a great unknown in many ways. I think that is in many ways why I haven't heard districts say this is why they're starting remote, but certainly I think a lot of parents, just because there's so much unknown about how disease spreads, or certainly indoors with the question of ventilation and HVAC has come up. I know there's still a lot of questions about how does this really work, and I think there's so much uncertainty there. That's why a lot of parents have opted to keep their students at home.
we actually, I think Guy, you're probably still on, but one of our speakers this summer from Idaho, Guy Blisner, school security specialist, talked about that back in, I think it was July when Guy was on. So that, and this Cliff Notes version of that conversation was around, yes, we are building this ship as we fly it, so to speak, but at the same time, there are established liability matters that are already oftentimes baked in, and working with childcare and aftercare programs at YMCA's, at Boys and Girls Clubs. So we're not exactly starting from a blank slate completely here. And then in terms of, COVID-related strategies, with, absent scientific definitive answers and sort of general consensus, what are the established, known, common practices: social distancing, PPE, frequent hand washing, and then from there, everything else kind of trickles. But those are the key benchmarks. And so, are you following those? Or do you have signage that's appropriate to that? And one of Guy's hammering points was document, document, document. When it comes to liability, it matters what you can prove that you did more than it matters what you did. And so, what's the standard of care? It's social distancing, it's PPE, specifically masks, and it's frequent hand washing. And then, regular cleaning and disinfecting. So if you're doing those things, do those things, document those things, have signage that points people to do those things, leverage your existing contractual relationships for some of these supplemental things. And that's, kind of your standard of care, says somebody who's not an attorney.
I would say it does seem like districts have documented a lot of what they're planning to do when students are back. But certainly, and I think some were being very intentional about, even if they're going to be back, when kids go back to Chicago, they're going to be in a cohort of 15, and that's sort of their group for the whole year. And even that, I think, is an example of where districts are trying to be proactive.
And I think they're trying really hard to tie themselves to health plans of the counties or of the states, so that they are doing what they would term best practice or best use of guidelines. So that ties to another government agency that gives them a backstop, so to speak.
Yeah.
And one thing that I'll just add is my colleague and I are going to try to tease out, what is the actual rules on when do you have to close a school? What's the sort of case load?
Quarantines,
and quarantine, and it does seem to vary across by state, and that's probably something that I think will be sort of an emerging thing to watch as schools get a better handle on what, can we be open if 5% of our students are testing positive for COVID, should we close? And I think the answer right now is yes. It's sort of like, well, how long? And then what happens when we come back?
And geographic size, right?
Yeah.
Don't you think? David, you have some districts that are significant in terms of geography, that one pocket may be able to close where another one stays open.
Right. Yeah. Right.
And if you didn't get a chance to listen in last week, or haven't seen listen to the recording last week, we had, we'll wrap up here in a second, Dr. Lauren Ansel Myers from UT Austin, just brilliant conversation, epidemiologist. She walked us through sort of from an epidemiologist's perspective, the history of this virus and its spread and some probable causalities there. And then she left us with a formula that can use to predict number of cases based upon the size of your school that you're planning to open, 100, 200, 300, 500, how many bodies, relative to the spread in your community. She gave us a nice little formula there, very simple. And she explains in the recording kind of the assumptions behind it. But that was a great tool. If you want to kind of look that up, you can find it on YouTube or our website. And speaking of website and keeping track of this as we wrap up, Sean and Lisa, where can folks, we can find you on the webs. Where can we, track your work as you're coming through and identifying what Baltimore is doing, what Disney is doing, what LA and Fairfax do? Where can we track your work so that we can see what other folks are doing in one location?
Yeah, so our website is crpe.org. And if you click on their current research, it should be on the main slider, but it'll take you to our current research page. We'll go right into all of our COVID work, and you can launch our database, and pull up a giant Google Doc, and you're getting the updates as we put them in on sort of the 106 districts that we're tracking. But we certainly are trying to pull out our higher level findings on our blog. So our blog is a great place to see all of our kind of summaries and things like that.
And I just dropped it in our chat. So.
Oh yeah, Lisa.
Great.
Perfect. It's in the chat. Thank you, Lisa. So you can we can benchmark that. Right. Okay. Well, Lisa, Sean, thank you very much for your time and for putting together these resources for us and give us a snapshot view of kind of where districts are at and opening and what they're thinking in terms of learning loss interventions. We knew that this was very much a preliminary conversation on the topic, as the sort of the hierarchy of need right now is like, how do we open safely, right? Yep. And knowing that this is coming, but this is the iceberg underneath the water. This is the next conversation will be, what do we do about this? Because this is going to be a wicked problem for years to come. So. Yeah. All right. Well, awesome. I hope to have you back and some updates here on the work, and we'll be chasing down some of these districts you mentioned. That's really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. We enjoyed being here.
Thanks, you guys.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day, and hope to talk to you next week.